In Dogen's collection of koans, the mana Shobogenzo, case 166, very short. A monk goes to Yunmen and he says, when birth and death come, how do we avoid them? And Yunmen says, where are they? That's it. That's the whole story. This case is on my mind today because it's February 7th, and February 8th is the day when we mark the Buddha's death. There's a sesshin in many temples and monasteries that, just like Rohatsu, starts at the beginning of February and builds up to tomorrow morning, marking that moment. It comes to mind for me because it's so obviously a moment of birth and death. We think of the Buddha dying, we think of everyone gathered around. These amazing paintings of the funeral where all the animals come and observe his body. But in that same moment of him passing away is the birth of what we would call Buddhism. The Buddha died, and everyone left behind was faced with this choice. What do we do? Some of them left. Their teacher had gone. Why stay? Some of them, I'm sure, went on to found their own schools or to teach in their own quarters, because why be part of something that isn't what it was? But most stayed. Most saw the loss of their teacher and realized that not all was lost, that something could be built out of that. It's beautiful, and it's simultaneous. But this koan speaks to much more than just that simultaneity. And I'll say it again because it's so short. A monk goes to Yunmen and he says, when birth and death come, how do we avoid them? This is a monk who wants to transcend. He wants to resolve the great matter of life and death. He doesn't want to be stuck in this. He's looking for nirvana. He's looking for a way out. And that question, that basic question, goes back to the beginning. It goes back to the time of the Buddha. It's a fair question. He says, when birth and death come, how do we avoid them? And Yunmen says, where are they? And it's so playful. We might imagine that the monk says, how do we avoid them? And Yunmen says, where are they? As if death is a hooded figure with a scythe, and birth is baby New Year in a diaper. It's as if the monk said, I'm afraid of death, and Yunmen said, well, then let's hide. How do we avoid birth and death? Yunmen could have given a different answer. He could have said, they're here. Because of course they are. Every moment of our lives is this inhalation and exhalation of the world, of things arising and things passing away, of things seeming to generate and then things being lost. That's what we're trapped in, or so it seems. The Buddha was no different. He sounds so special. He sounds like such a big deal. We still mark his death after 2,500 years. But he was still born and he still passed away in exactly the way that you will, in exactly the way that I will. There's no distinction. So to the question, where are they? We could say, well, they're everywhere. But that's not really what Yunmen is saying. Where are they? I don't want to fall into some Zen speak about absolute. It's not like saying there is no spoon. There is life, there is death. We experience them. To say something like there is no death negates far too much. To say that there is no birth closes off everything. It's not that there is no birth and there is no death. It's that there's nothing to avoid. Birth and death, as soon as we say the words, we enter into our ideas about what these are. We enter into the idea that they're distinct from one another, and that they're distinct from us. There's so much in this question, how can we avoid them? To ask how can we avoid birth and death is to say that birth and death are over there, and I'm here. So I can hide. So I can outsmart them. So I can find a way past, or a way through, or a way around. Yunmen penetrates this so completely. This is a repeat of the story of Bodhidharma and Huiko, his first disciple. Huiko stood in the snow for days, waiting for the attention of Bodhidharma. And Bodhidharma just ignored him. He sat in his cave and he stared at the wall, perfectly still, perfectly silent, seemingly indifferent, until Huiko could not take it anymore and he cut off his own arm. And he went into the cave and he threw the arm down in front of Bodhidharma and he said, "Pacify my mind." And Bodhidharma turned around and looked at him and said, "Show it to me." It isn't in that moment that Huiko understood the nature of his mind. It's not that he understood his own nature. It's that he saw, maybe just for a second, a glimpse of the scale of this reality. The all-inclusiveness of this reality. And how he could only see it as it. Not from within and not from without. When this monk asks how to avoid life and death, birth and death, same, different translations. And Yunmen says, where are they? He's asking exactly the same question as Bodhidharma did when he says, show me your mind. Show me life and death, and I'll show you how to avoid them. And we don't need the rest of the koan because we know that the monk couldn't do it. We know that the monk couldn't point to them. The monk couldn't put a position on a map. We know that in the next moment, something fell away from the monk's eyes. And he realized, again, maybe just for a second, that his story about this life, about this reality, about this world, doesn't even scratch the surface of what this really is. For 1 second, maybe, he's able to see it as it. This is what we call direct pointing to the mind. This is where Zen really shines. Not in explaining things, not in clarifying things in the way that we would usually hope, but in giving us an opportunity just for a moment to let go of this thing that we're holding, that we thought made it make sense, that we thought made it containable and simple. And in fact, just obscures. There's nothing to avoid because how could we? There's nothing the Buddha could have avoided. What would he have done? This is all good news. And that's where I'll stop.